Donc, ça fait plaisir pour moi de vous présenter Guillaume Chomiki, le professeur à l'Université de Durham, au Royaume-Uni. Donc, il a publié son premier article en 2007. Quel âge avait-il? 10 ans? Je ne sais pas en fait. Il est jeune quand même. Donc, ça, c'est sa première aventure dans la science. Il avait 17 ans, j'imagine, pour faire la mathématique. Donc, après ça, il a développé une belle carrière. Donc, ces articles sont bien cités quand même. Et pour son bac, il a fait ses études à Manchester, au Royaume-Uni. Donc, ça, c'est le parce que c'est cette publication de ton bac. Et après ça, il a déménagé en Allemagne pour travailler avec Susanne Renner, qui est là, pour faire son doctorat. C'est à Munich, München. Donc, après ça, il a développé une belle carrière. Et je suis tellement impressionné parce que j'ai rencontré Guillaume à l'époque, il combine la partie empirique et aussi la partie théorique. Donc, il a beaucoup d'articles dans les journaux. Là-dessus, il a fait des terrains au Fidji. Et ça, c'est un exemple des articles, de ces publications. Donc, il a beaucoup de choses à partager. On est très content qu'il a décidé de nous rendre visite ici à Québec. Donc, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Juan Carlos. Merci beaucoup pour ton introduction, Juan Carlos. Ça me fait très plaisir d'être ici au Québec avec vous. Alors, je dois vous dire que j'ai vécu 5 ans au Québec, à Sept-Îles, et j'ai visité plusieurs fois la ville de Québec. La dernière fois, ça fait, je crois, 28 ans. J'avais 5 ans. La ville n'a pas beaucoup changé. Moi, par contre, je trouve que c'est assez différent. Et donc, pour mon talk, pour ma présentation, je vais donc parler en anglais. Ce sera plus simple. J'ai fait toutes mes études en Angleterre, comme Juan Carlos a dit. Donc, je vais switcher à l'anglais. So today, I would like to talk to you about mutualistic dependence and its impact on the evolution and stability of cooperation between species. So when we think about mutualisms, such as the leafcutter ants, the ant acacia symbiosis, or even Nemo and its animal, we sometimes have this idea that there are some evolutionary oddities. But in fact, virtually every species on Earth is involved in one or more mutualisms. And these interactions really are really important and form up to half of all the interaction within communities. And when we look at a complex ecosystem such as a rainforest, we see that key functions such as pollination, seed dispersal, nutrition, and defense are actually performed through mutualisms. So they are really important in shaping our ecosystems. In fact, mutualisms modulate biodiversity both at the ecological scale by modulating, for example, species coexistence, but also at the macroevolution scale by influencing speciation and extinction. Mutualisms are also really important to us. For example, in pollination, which provide really key ecosystem services. So all these crops, which you can see here, are performed either directly or indirectly through insect pollination. So these crops are reliant on insect pollination. But really the reason why mutualism fascinates me is that they have long been a riddle to evolutionary biologists. Darwin himself wrote in The Origin of Species, natural selection cannot possibly produce any modification in any one species for the good of another species. If it could be proved that any one species, any part of a structure in any one species had been formed for the exclusive good of another species, it would annihilate my theory, for such could not have been produced through natural selection. So Darwin, even though he predicted some of the most amazing mutualisms, such as this orchid, which has this nectar spur of about 30 centimeters, he predicted that this would be pollinated by an insect of having an equally long tongue. It was really seeing a big problem of imagining species evolving traits to benefit other species in light of natural selection. And really, it's easy to understand why. A good starting point to understand why cooperation has long been difficult to understand in light of natural selection is the prisoner's dilemma. So here what we are looking at is a game between two players, the Nile crocodile and that bird, the Nile plover, and they can both cooperate or defect, okay? And what we are looking at is the benefits B and the cost C, all from the crocodile's perspective. So when both partners cooperate, we have a nice mutualism in which the bird takes out the parasite, the ectoparasites from the crocodile's mouth. Okay, so this comes, so there's the benefit of cooperation minus the cost, B minus C. Then there is a situation where the crocodile cooperate, but the birds actually defect. So instead of taking only the parasites, let's say that it takes a piece of the flesh from the crocodile's mouth. So there is no benefits from cooperation, there is just the cost minus C. Then there is a scenario where none of the partners interact. And finally, and this is where the dilemma comes from, there is the case where the crocodile defect and eat the bird, okay? And what you can see is that in any single game play, it is actually more beneficial to defect than to cooperate, okay? You get higher immediate return by defecting from a potential cooperation. And that's the very problem why cooperation, both within and between species, has been initially a big issue to understand in light of evolution. A major leap forward was made in the early 80s with the advent of early computers, where so they were actually able to play real tournaments with real players, and that very same game, okay, which they call the iterated prisoner's dilemma. So they were playing the same game again and again and again. And what arose from this work is that they realized that cooperation can actually evolve and be stable if you start to cooperate. You play a strategy called tit for tat. You start to cooperate, and then you do whatever the other partner does. Okay, so and when you start to cooperate and your partner defects, you defect, and the second defection is a punishment for the cheaters, basically. Okay, so it's basically what is written in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's a very primitive strategy, but it works actually to evolve cooperation. Right, so we see how there might be a way for cooperation to evolve. But does it actually apply to mutualism? Well, one big issue is that there are many assumptions which are not met. So for example, these basic model assume no ecological difference between species, which obviously it goes against the very definition of mutualism. It assumes that the services cannot evolve. It assumes that the payoffs associated with cooperation, defection, cheating and being cheated are constant, which again doesn't make any sense. Something which we know of mutualism is that they are often very context dependent, meaning that the cost and benefits actually varies across context, environmental context, for example. And it assumes obviously that partners need to remember previous interaction, which is again something very system specific. So the point I want to make here is that to understand cooperation within mutualism, we need many empirical studies of many different systems, okay, in addition. And we can't really expect that one size fits all when you see such an array of diverse interactions. So for today's talk, I would like to focus on one particular dimension of the variation of mutualism, and this is mutualistic dependence. The fact that the strength of this interaction varies widely from nothing to facultative loose interactions between many different species to obligate interactions on which species depend for survival or reproduction. And precisely, I want to ask three main questions during this talk. So does mutualistic dependence affect the likelihood of breakdown across macroevolutionary scale? Does the mutualistic dependence affect the efficiency of the services provided? And finally, how facultative versus obligate mutualisms are stabilized in light of different threats, such as cheating. And to address this question, I work on plant symbioses, and these are symbioses in which plants offer nesting sites, which can actually vary very much in structure, to symbiotic ants in return to nutrients or defense, sometimes both. And these interactions have evolved across the plant tree of life, at least 158 times, and they've been lost many, many times as well. And that's a really powerful system because it's highly evolutionarily replicated, which means that we can ask a number of, it gives us statistical power to ask a number of evolutionary and ecological questions. Okay, so let's start with that first question. Does mutualistic dependence affect the likelihood of mutualism breakdown across the geological scale? And my main empirical system is a group called the Aidinophytinae. This is a group in the plant family Rubiaceae, the coffee family, of about 105 species. They are almost all epiphytes, and they have this very conspicuous structure, domatia, in which, well, the structure and function actually varies a lot, and I will come back to this. But typically you have ants living inside them. And they're distributed all around Southeast Asia to the northern part of Australia, New Guinea, and go as far as Fiji, where I do my fieldwork. And in this group of about 105 species, we have three main strategies. There are species which form a generalist and facultative mutualism with ants, such as these Fijian species. And here what happens is that you have this domatia. Any ant species, any arbor ant species can live virtually in this domatia. And the plant benefits from nutrients, which comes as a byproduct of nesting. Okay, so it's a very opportunistic relationship. It's a nutritional mutualism, and there is no obligation. And again, it involves a wide range of ant species. For example, this particular species, I found it in association with over 14 species of ants, entirely unrelated. Then there are species forming specialized and obligate mutualism with ants, such as this particular species. So here, the plants not only provide this nice sturdy nesting site, but also food rewards for the ant colony. And the ants not only provide nutrition, but also defense against herbivores, as well as dispersal. And I will come back to these points. And finally, there is a group of species which form no symbiosis with ants at all. So they have retained a tuber, which typically has a really odd morphology. These particular species is hollow, has water inside, and is frequently found with tree frogs, but there is no ants at all. So the first thing I did, and I was doing my PhD, was to reconstruct the phylogeny of this group. And I used this phylogeny, so this is a phylogeny sampling about 75% of the species from these Aidinophytinae. And I was able to use this phylogeny to trace the evolutionary history of these different strategies, which I just presented to you. What you can see in that tree is that the symbiosis started as a facultative mutualism, which you can see in the right here. And then we have 4 independent origins of obligate partnerships inside throughout the evolutionary history. But more importantly, we have 12 independent losses, which you see in blue in the tree here. 12 independent losses. So this was great because I was able to study the context of breakdown, which I won't talk about today. But the point I want to make here is that all these 12 events of breakdown of mutualism occurred from the facultative mutualism, from this generalist opportunistic partnership, and not from the specialized obligate one. Okay, so it seems that mutualistic dependence is a really important predictor of the evolutionary stability of mutualisms over time. And in fact, I did a meta-analysis looking at many different groups, which I separated whether they were facultative, but also whether they were generalists, so involving many different partners or involving one or very few partners. And we see really the same pattern. We see that dependence is a really important predictor of the evolutionary stability of mutualisms over time. Okay, and so that's the end of my first question. So we see that these mutualistic dependence is really something important to predict how mutualisms will be stable over time at a large time scale. Okay, but are they more efficient? Okay, does mutualistic dependence affect the efficiency of the services provided? Well, to address this question, I focused on the same group, but just zooming into one subclade here, which is endemic from the Fiji Islands when I do my field work. And here we have a clade of obligate species and a grade of 3 facultative generalist species. Okay. And what is great is that they occur in the same environment. So we can actually do an experiment in the fields on these 2 different strategies within the same environment, so without any major confounding environmental variable. And the question I want to ask here is, do the obligate ant plants get more nitrogen from the ants than the facultative ones? Okay? Is it more efficient in terms of nutrition? The first thing I did was to look at the structure, the 3D structure of these domatia. And what you see here is sections, 3D sections of the domatia in an obligate versus in a facultative species. And what you can see is that in the obligate species, the walls, the inner walls of the domatia, so this is the inside where the ants would be living, the surface is actually very different. So we have warty surfaces, which you can see here in orange, which have these small protuberances, which are evenly spaced and evenly shaped all around these areas. And we see also areas which are very smooth, which lack any such protuberances and seem to be sort of wax covered. They are really smooth and shiny. So a very clear-cut general structure. When we look at the facultative species, we don't see any of that. We have areas which are a bit more smooth-like, areas which are a bit more warty-like, but there is no clear-cut differences. They're all sort of mixed up between one another. And they're also often internal roots growing inside. So it's really a bit of a mess. So there is no such differentiation of the inner domatia walls. So then what I did was using stable isotopes to feed the symbiotic ants and then trace where the ants were actually fertilizing, where the ants were providing nutrients inside these domatia. Again, focusing on these different types of inner wall cavities, which I just showed you. What you can see is that in the obligate species, there is a very clear-cut pattern. So all the stable isotope is identified here in the warty cavity, which means that the ants are fertilizing these warty cavities here. But we can virtually detect basically nothing in the smooth walls here. When we look at the facultative species, we see a very different pattern. Again, as I said, there is no clear-cut differentiation, but when we look at areas which are a bit more smooth-like and areas which are a bit more warty-like, we see that both have a signal, even though they seem to be much more in the smooth-like area. And working with these systems can be actually quite challenging because the ants are often quite aggressive. So this is what they do to my tweezers. I'm using these gloves and double tapes, which doesn't quite work. After 5 minutes, you see that some always manage to escape and bite me. And sometimes you make interesting discoveries inside these domatia, such as these scorpion, which was rather scary. Anyway, then I run another series of experiments. And this time I injected in different individuals solutions with nitrogen isotopes, both mineral and organic, of different solutions, of different concentrations. And I use this approach to look at the capacity of uptake of the different types of inner wall surfaces, which I just showed you. So this is the results for the organic, so the 15N glycine, and here the inorganic nitrogen. And what you can see is that in the obligate species, the smooth cavity has a really limited ability to uptake nutrients, while the warty cavity is really highly absorptive. And in fact, at 500 micromolar, we did not even reach saturation. We see a very different picture in the facultative species, which so both type, the warty-like and the smooth-like cavities, are able to take up nutrients, but very inefficiently. And this is what we see here. There is a saturation point which arise very quickly, and so they can take up nutrients, but not in a very efficient manner. So overall, this is the pattern that we have here. So we have the facultative generalist system in which there is a limited uptake capacity of all these inner wall cavities, and we have no particular selection on the location of defecation. It's really opportunistic, as I said, and there is no targeting of fertilization in these systems. What we see in the obligate system is rather different. So we have a clear-cut separation, differentiation of the walls, which is really mirrored by the plant physiology. So there is a high uptake capacity here in the warty areas, which you see in orange, a very limited, if any, capacities for uptake in the smooth cavities. And there is really exclusive defecation on these warty cavities. And actually, these smooth cavities is where the ants rear their brood. So they're really having this clear-cut differentiation between brood rearing here and fertilization of the plants. And this is also really matching the way in which the plant has evolved to uptake nutrients. So that system is clearly much more complicated, right? But is it actually more efficient in terms of ultimate nitrogen provisioning? So to address this question, I ran a 16-month ant exclusion experiment. So I removed the ants and so sampled the plant tissues after 16 months. So what you can see here, so here we are looking at two different species of obligate ant plants. The amount of nitrogen derived from the ants is much greater in the obligate as opposed to the facultative system. So the ant plants are getting 2.5 times more nitrogen from ants than in the facultative species. So it seems, in fact, that dependence is also a very important factor in predicting the efficiency of the services and resources traded within mutualism. And in fact, this is a pattern which we find in many other systems, for example, in pollination systems as well. Okay, that when you become obligately dependent on a particular partner, you tend to evolve greater rewards. And so this work is continuing in a very genomics-heavy work in my lab. And one of my PhD students, Noah Bourne, is currently sequencing the genomes of all Stromenaria species to find for signatures for, in particular, these nutrient uptake genes. Right. So now let's look at how the obligate versus facultative mutualisms are stabilized in light of different threats. So again, I'm using the same system, the same pigeon clade of ant plants called Stromenaria, in which there is this obligate generalist clade and this grade of facultative generalist species. When we look at an ant plant like this, there is a positive feedback between the host plant and the ant colony. Okay, so the bigger the plant grows, the more nesting space there is, the more the ant colony grows, the more it feeds back on more nutrition and more defense, and so on and so forth. So there is a reinforcing circle here. And this is actually a stabilizing mechanism we call partner fidelity feedback. Okay, so there is a positive correlation between fitnesses. Right, but when it comes to reproduction, there is a conflict. Any amount of carbon that the plant invests into reproduction comes in conflict with this particular symbiosis. And in fact, the best way to picture this conflict over reproduction are some systems both in South America and in Africa in which particular symbiotic ants have evolved the ability to castrate their plant hosts, to redirect carbon into domation growth, into bigger houses, basically. So one potential way to resolve, to mitigate this conflict over reproduction would be if the ant partner was actually taking control of the reproduction of the plant. And this is actually what you would see in a farming system, in agriculture. And farming mutualisms have been defined by having four critical steps, four defining steps, namely habitual planting, in which the farmer plant the crops in a very particular way. Then there is cultivation, which is really the key step in which the farmer enhances the growth of the crop at sometimes, or at least initially, at a point in time where the crop has nothing to offer in return. So it's not really a usual mutualism. So it can do this obviously in many different ways, in getting rid of competitors, in providing nutrients. Then there is obviously the harvest, and then there is some form of dependency here, pictured by these Mexican women baking delicious tortillas. And really, there are very few systems other than ours which really fulfills these four criteria. Okay, we see that in the fungus farming of ants, the leafcutter ants, the Atine ants, and in termites and in beetles as well. But so far, we did not see that in mutualism involving plants. Even though we know of many different farming life systems in which one partner cultivates the others, but they never really fulfill these four steps. And when I first came to Fiji, I was struck by one particular thing, which is the clustering. So every triangle here shows a different individual of ant plant, of obligate ant plant. And this is one branch of a tree. And just look at how many there are in these three. So I was really, if this was to be bird dispersed, that would have been rather surprising. And when I came closer, I realized that they were actually all interlinked. So every plant in that tree was interlinked by trails of ants going from one plant to the next. And I was able to map the distribution of these trails. And actually, they're all centered around what appeared to be the largest plant in the tree. And it turned out that it was actually the plant where the queen was. And so I did a number of experiments, observation experiments, to try and test for these four defining steps of agriculture. And this is the first one. So this ant called Philaidris nacazor, this Fijian ant, actually plant the seeds of Scomellaria. So they go and they collect the seed, they cut through the fruit roll, they collect the seed, and they plant them not in carton nest as you would see in the neotropics, but they plant them directly under tree bark. They find sunken pockets under tree bark, and here is a piece. I've just removed a piece of bark here, and you see a seed. And typically they plant a few seeds, 5 to sometimes 10 seeds. And what's also really interesting is that there are always a few ant workers which stay with the seeds, potentially to prevent predation. At least there are workers staying with the seeds as they germinate. So that first step is definitely occurring here. Then there is the question of cultivation. I was really surprised to see, and you can probably barely see the head of the ant right here. So this is a seedling, which is a diameter of about 2 centimeters here. There is a tiny domatia, as you can see, and there is the first entrance hall, which is opened here naturally. It's all plant-made. And there is already in these tiny plants an ant visiting. And when I watched these seedlings, I saw that ant workers were coming inside and outside. They were basically going in and out these tiny seedlings. And using the very same kind of experiments I showed you earlier, I was able to show basically that the ants are fertilizing the plants as early as the seedling stage. So they are really cultivating the plants fertilizing the plants from the seedling stage onwards. And as I also mentioned, they're also doing a defense function, which I won't be talking about today. Then there is the harvest. This is in a rather, not unique, but rather rare a kind of reward, which is called post-anthetic nectaries. So these are basically old flowers. So these are the calyx once the white corolla has fallen off. And you see this big nectary disc, okay? And the ants, the workers, continuously come and feed and bite through these epidermis and feed on these nectaries. And obviously, that's part of the reward for the ants, but the other part of the reward, obviously, is the nesting structure in which the ant colony lives. Then there is dependency, and there is actually obligate dependency on both sides. So when you do the ant exclusion experiment after these 16 months, you see that there is a massive increase in plant mortality, and often the plants don't look really healthy, and they seem to be attacked by pathogens, and they have some preliminary evidence showing that these ants actually have a microbiota which plays a functional defensive role in the symbiosis. But we don't exactly know how this dependency is mediated in the plant side. In the ant side, so here you see a Squamillaria phylogeny, and here is the ant phylogeny, and in yellow you see these different accession of these Fijian farming ants. And what you see mapped in that tree here is actually the ability to build a nest. So all arbor ant species typically build so-called carton nest, including Phylhydrous species, except that Fijian ant species. So this species has actually lost the ability to build its own nest, and therefore it relies obligately on the plant for nesting. So the dependence in the ant side appears to be mediated by the loss of ability, so a change in behavior, in the behavioral trait, which enable normally the ant to build carton nest. So there is obligate dependency in both sides, which means that we have actually a true agriculture in this system. And my PhD student, Laura Campbell, has been reviewing the different types of cultivation, farming-like mutualism, which includes many ant gardens in the neotropics, which don't fulfill all these 4 steps. And she's found that there are actually 3 main patterns in the way in which ants cultivate plants. So farming is really important because it mitigates the conflict over production. So by taking control of our production, there is no conflict over resource allocation, carbon allocation to a production, because it directly invests into making a bigger farm with more Squamillaria. So that's how this particular conflict is mitigated here. But what about exploiters of the system? So these nectaries, full of sugars and amino acids, could easily attract many exploiters of the system. How does it not happen? Well, when you look at these nectaries, they are rather unusual in the sense that there is no nectar which is released in this post-anthesis phase. And to access the sugary rewards, the ants have to bite through these thick epidermis. I was a bit surprised of that. And I thought that, well, the fact that, if the reward, the sugar reward is concealed, it would be a way to decrease the attraction. If you, for example, compare it to an extrafloral nectary or floral nectary, where you have tons of sugar, which is exposed in the rainforest. And so to test this, this idea of exclusive rewards, I conducted a sort of cafeteria experiment in which I offered intact nectaries or cupules, nectaries with so cupules, which was basically the calyx with damaged nectaries, so exposing the sugar, and intact nectaries with a drop of sugar solution. And in blue, this is the obligate farming ant, Philaedoris nagazo, and here are 4 potentially exploiting ants. So these are just basically arbor ant species from the Fijian rainforest. And what you can see, the key result is right here. Only the obligate farming ant really takes advantage of the intact nectaries. Whether this involves any chemical signaling, I have no idea, but at least something makes these rewards, so concealing these rewards make them more exclusive, and these Philaedoris nagazo ant, these farming ants, as a way to detect and identify these nectaries and take advantage of them. And this leads me to the sort of interesting conclusion that when you evolve increased dependency, you have to increase your investment into your partner because you want to have one particular partner, which typically would be a better partner. You have to give more. But at the same time, you have to make sure that these greater rewards don't get stealed. You have to prevent from exploitation at the same time. And this is actually what these systems do when there are many different systems which have similar analogous way to actually get rid of potential exploiters. Right. So we have seen that in these specialized and obligate system, there is 2 important mechanisms. Well, 3, in fact. There is this coupling of, there is partner fidelity feedback. So this coupling of ant colony size and plant size, and these positive feedback which reinforces itself. The conflict over production is minimized because the farmer takes advantage of their production, control of their production. And there is also partner choice of making these exclusive rewards, which limit exploitation from other species. So what about the generalist system? So here, as I said, what you have is, this plant, which is this Domatia. There is no food rewards. There is no obvious way to control, what species could take advantage of the Domatia. Okay. And there are many different partners. There are many different potential partners and actual partners. So both mutualism and symbiosis theories have long predicted that having many different unrelated partners would be a bad thing for mutualism. So Kevin Foster and Toons Winsler's in his general model for the evolution of mutualism basically argue that it could lead to a situation of tragedy of the commons, wherein the poor partners could be maintained in the system as cheaters and take advantage because they would be both good and bad partners. And so this would be a way to maintain the poor partners in the system, and which therefore could potentially lead to breakdown of the mutualism. Stephen Frank was more focusing on symbiotic mutualisms and had a very different stance and an argument here, which was the fact that there would be direct conflict between competing symbionts within the same host. And this in turn will actually harm the host and could also lead to the demise of these systems. And this really must be true when we think about ants. We know that many ant species really hate each other, are incredibly aggressive. And even within the same species, actually, different colonies would, in many species, kill each other to death. And these mutualisms occur in the rainforest, and this is also where we have the greatest abundance of ants. Okay, so we have this amazing abundance of ants. So both species richness and abundance of ants in the rainforest. ants are aggressive. How can we maintain these systems? So again, for specialized ant mutualism, it's not an issue because these specialized systems have evolved ways to make rewards exclusive. So I presented you one example. There are many others. So in the Central American acacia, for example, the food rewards are also locked and are only digestible to the true mutualists, the myrmex. In Southeast Asian macaranga, some species have evolved a waxy surface in which only the true ant mutualists can actually work and the others would just sleep. But what about in this system? Okay, we have this system in which there is no way to, there is no selection basically. How can you actually maintain a functional mutualism here? And this question really started to bother me when I discovered this, namely finding two different ant colonies from two totally different species in the same plant. How in the world is that possible? It's really something that theory would argue against and predicted that it couldn't be stable. So my first step to investigate this question was to actually look at spatial structure, because spatial structure has long been known to be important in mutualism. So what you can see here are 3D reconstruction based on CT scanning data, and the different colors are the cast of different cavities. So every color shows a cavity which is connected to the outside, but not connected between one another. And what you see in the obligate system is that there is one small cavity in red, which is independent, and this is actually the embryonic cavity. But the rest of the plot, most of the plot is actually occupied by this yellow cavity, which is all interconnected, okay? All interconnected and super complex with tons of radiculation and bridges basically between these different galleries. When you look at the facultative species, you see a very different pattern. You see different cavities which are not connected, connected to the other side, but not connected between one another. So could that potentially be the thing, the fact that you have different compartments, different apartments, and is that enough to maintain coexistence? So first, obviously, I looked at this 3D structure at all the obligate clades. So this is all the Fijian Stromenaria species. And you see that all the obligate species have this one big cavity, and all the facultative species have multiple cavities. And here is an example of a 3D analysis of a larger generalist plant. So you see here that there is 17 different cavities, and here is the different path connected to the outside, but of these different cavities. So we have really a network of cavities, but which are all independent within the same plant. So is that the thing? Is that enough? You know, making the different compartments, is that what is actually driving the coexistence in these systems? So to address this question, I performed a number of experiments in which I offered a sugar solution to different ant species, potentially living in these plants, and checked whether they were co-foraging without conflict, or whether there would be conflict over foraging, sorry. And I looked at all the different mutualists which I found in these rainforests. And what you see is that with the exception of one species, which actually is an invasive species, all the ants are perfectly able to co-forage as long as the cavities are kept separate. So if you keep the nest separate, these different ant species are perfectly happy to co-forage without conflict. So at this point, I thought, well, maybe these species are actually pre-adapted, not that aggressive, and are pre-adapted to live together. And so I performed a different kind of experiment in which I took 10 workers from one species and placed it into the colony of another species. And again, looked at whether there would be avoidance or fight. And here the pattern is rather different. So the majority of species, there was conflict in the majority of species, at least in some combination. And when you actually scale these results by the abundance of these different mutualists, you see that something like 93% of the ants are aggressive. So there is really an inherent conflict between living together if the nests are not separated. So then we teamed up with a mathematician, Dirk Metzler in Munich, who modeled this system, and it was basically looking at three different stages. So this is E for empty domatia, S for a domatia with a small ant colony, D is for dove, so non-aggressive ants, and H for oak, aggressive ants, and L is a plant with a large ant colony, and basically tried to see what conditions, what number of compartments basically you need to have an optimal number of plants with large ant colonies, which was deemed to be most beneficial. And you see basically this relationship, as we expected, that the more aggressive ant species, or this is the frequency of aggressive ant species, the more aggressive ant species and the more number of incipient invaders arriving to the plant, the higher number of compartments you need. So that all makes sense. That's sort of convincing evidence that this compartmentalization works as a promoting conflict-free living in these complex compartmentalized domatia. But really the critical evidence would be to have domatia with different ant colonies and break this compartmentalization and see whether it actually affects conflict. And I was able to do these experiments last summer. So here is a section of a very large, about this big, domatia, and you see two species of ants. So here are these black components here, and here are these orange components right here. So large-bodied ants, really aggressive, both of them, and really, really large colonies of over 3,000 workers inside. Okay, so they were living in different compartments, as I explained. And the minute where I broke the connection between these compartments, there was an immediate fight to death. So even though, and actually after about 1 hour, 3/4 of the workers of these very large colonies were basically dead, because the ants were very similar in their competitive abilities. So that really shows that breaking compartmentalization leads to conflict, but also that this conflict has a really high cost for the plant, because as you can see here, it really decreases the number of symbionts which are bringing in your nutrients. So it turns out that this compartmentalization is a really simple mechanism which basically do this. Okay, you just limit the physical contact with between symbionts, and that is enough to promote the conflict-free living of these different species. And we actually not only see this with different ant species, but also with different arthropods and even small vertebrates. So they are actually geckos living in some of these plants, which are able to share the domatia in different cavities. So before I end, I just want to do some small publicity. So there are 2 postdoc openings in my lab. One, which is a 4-year position, which is basically a hardcore genomic study of these idenophytine clade, looking at how does mutualism breakdown impact genome evolution, and much more, lots of really interesting questions, I think. And a macroevolutionary position of 2.5 years, which will be dealing with the analysis of some really amazing databases for pollination, dispersal, direct defense, and with symbionts. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. I thank obviously a number of collaborators and Suzanne Renner, who is with us today, my funders, and you for your attention. Thank you.